This is a fictional story. The hardest door I ever tried to open was the one I believed would always be waiting for me. My suitcase was still standing beside my feet when I realized my key no longer fit the lock. I slid it in once, then twice, then a third time, listening to nothing but the quiet click of metal refusing to turn. 24 hours earlier, that same key had opened the front door without hesitation. 24 hours earlier, my son had hugged me and promised, "Mom, you will never have to worry again." My name is Evelyn Brooks. I was 69 years old when I sold the only home I had ever truly loved because my son told me his family was about to lose everything. Standing on that front porch with one suitcase, one framed photograph of my late husband, and nowhere else to go, I realized something had changed much faster than I could understand. The strange part was not that the lock had been replaced. The strange part was that I still wanted to believe there had been some kind of mistake. The day before had felt almost hopeful. I had signed the closing papers for the little white house where my husband Richard and I had spent 42 wonderful years together. Every room carried a memory. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon whenever I baked apple pie. The hallway wall still held tiny pencil marks where we measured Michael's height every birthday until he left for college. Richard had built the back porch with his own hands during one unforgettable summer when money was tight, but dreams were still easy to afford. Selling that house felt like saying goodbye to another piece of him. Yet I did it without hesitation because Michael sat across from me with tired eyes and a voice filled with worry. He explained that unexpected financial problems were closing in on them. He insisted they needed help quickly or they might lose the home where my grandchildren were growing up. I never asked to see paperwork. I never questioned his story. Mothers rarely ask for proof when their children ask for help. They simply reach for whatever they have left to give. The closing appointment lasted less than an hour. I smiled politely for the photographs, shook hands with strangers, and accepted the cashier's check that represented nearly everything Richard and I had spent a lifetime building together. By that afternoon, most of the money had already been transferred exactly where Michael asked me to send it. He hugged me tightly and whispered, "Dad would be proud of you." Those words stayed with me all evening as I packed the last few boxes. I folded Richard's favorite flannel shirt one final time before placing it beside our wedding album inside a small cardboard box marked family. I locked the front door of my old house for the very last time, handed the keys to the new owners, and drove toward what I believed would be the next chapter of my life. Michael had promised I would have my own bedroom. Amber had smiled and said she had already bought new curtains to make the room feel welcoming. I believed every word because trust had always come naturally inside our family. When I pulled into their driveway the following afternoon, the sun was shining, birds were singing, and nothing looked unusual. I carried my suitcase up the front steps, balanced the framed photograph of Richard under one arm, smiled to myself, and reached into my purse for the key Michael had given me only the day before. Amber opened the door before I had the chance to knock. She smiled for only a moment, just long enough to let me believe everything was exactly as Michael had promised. Then her eyes drifted toward the suitcase beside my feet, and the warmth disappeared from her face. I lifted the key still resting in my hand and gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I think something is wrong with the lock," I said. "The key Michael gave me will not turn." She glanced at the key without reaching for it. "It is not supposed to work anymore," she replied calmly. For a second I thought I had misunderstood. "What do you mean?" I asked. She folded her arms across her sweater and remained standing in the doorway. "We changed the locks this morning." I stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence. Surely she was going to explain that the locksmith had made extra copies or that Michael had forgotten to call me. Instead, she simply stood there. Behind her, I could see the entryway exactly as it had looked the day before. The family photographs still lined the hallway. My grandchildren's shoes still rested beside the front door. Even the blue curtains she had proudly shown me yesterday were hanging in the guest room window. Everything looked familiar except the way she was looking at me. "Michael said I would be living here," I said quietly. "Michael is still at work," Amber answered. "We talked after you left yesterday. We think it is better if everyone has a little space for now." The words settled over me with a strange emptiness. "Space," I repeated. "I sold my house yesterday." She nodded once as though acknowledging an ordinary fact. "Yes, and we appreciate everything you did for us. But having another adult living here full-time is more complicated than we expected." I looked beyond her shoulder, hoping to hear Michael's voice somewhere inside the house. Instead, I heard Emma laughing upstairs while a television played softly in the living room. Life inside continued as though nothing unusual was happening on the front porch. I tightened my grip on the framed photograph of Richard tucked beneath my arm. Could I at least come inside until Michael gets home? I asked. Amber hesitated just long enough to answer the question without using the word no. Today is not a good day. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small white envelope, and handed it to me. Inside was a folded sheet of paper with the name of a nearby motel and the address printed neatly underneath. Michael said this place is comfortable, she explained. Just for a night or two until everyone figures things out. I looked from the paper back to her face, searching for even the smallest sign that she felt uncomfortable. There was none. She believed she was being reasonable. That realization hurt more than anger would have. Before I could speak again, she gently closed the door. I stood there listening to the soft click of the new lock engaging from the inside. My suitcase remained exactly where I had placed it. So did Richard's photograph. The only thing that had moved was the future I thought I had been promised. After several minutes, I carried my suitcase back to my car, placed Richard's picture carefully on the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove toward the little motel whose address was still folded quietly inside my hand, praying that when Michael finally called, there would be an explanation capable of making any of this make sense. The motel room was clean, quiet, and painfully ordinary. A small lamp glowed beside the bed. The air conditioner hummed steadily beneath the window, and the floral bedspread looked as though it had been there for 20 years. I placed Richard's framed photograph on the nightstand before setting my suitcase beside the dresser. For a long time, I simply sat on the edge of the bed with my hands folded in my lap, staring at the telephone, waiting for it to ring. I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Michael had always returned my calls. He had never forgotten my birthday. He had never spoken to me with anything but kindness. Surely he would call as soon as he learned what had happened. An hour passed, then another. As evening settled outside the window, I finally picked up my phone and dialed his number. It went straight to voicemail. I left a short message telling him where I was and asking him to call whenever he could. I made certain my voice sounded calm. I did not want him to think I was angry. I wanted him to know I was confused. While I waited, memories quietly filled the silence. Richard and I had bought our little white house during the summer after Michael was born. We could barely afford the mortgage then. Richard worked 6 days a week as an electrician while I taught second grade at the elementary school across town. Every extra dollar went toward that house. We painted the bedrooms ourselves. We planted maple trees in the backyard that eventually grew taller than the roof. Every Christmas, Michael insisted on hanging the first ornament beside the fireplace because Richard always said every home deserved traditions more than decorations. Looking back, I realized we had built much more than a house. We had built the place where our son learned what family meant. When Richard became ill years later, he often sat on the back porch watching the sunset while talking about the future. He worried that I would be lonely after he was gone, but he never worried that I would be alone. Michael will always look after you, he told me one evening. We raised a good man. I believed those words with all my heart, and even now I wanted to keep believing them. Around 9 o'clock, my phone finally rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and relief washed over me so quickly that I smiled before answering. "Mom," he said, sounding tired. "I just listened to your message." "Michael," I replied softly. "I think there has been some misunderstanding. Amber said the locks were changed. She gave me the address of a motel." The line fell silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded uncertain. "Amber told me everyone needed a little time to adjust." I closed my eyes. "Adjust to what?" I asked. "I sold my home because you said we would all live together." Another long pause followed. "Can we talk in a couple of days?" he said quietly. "Things are a little complicated right now." His answer settled heavily in my chest. Not because he sounded angry, but because he sounded as though he already knew more than he was willing to say. After we ended the call, I looked toward Richard's photograph resting beneath the soft motel lamp. For the first time since selling our home, a question entered my mind that I had never allowed myself to ask before. What if the story I had been told was never the whole story to begin with? The next morning I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because the unfamiliar silence inside the motel room refused to let me rest any longer. For nearly 43 years, I had begun each day in the same house. I knew exactly which floorboard creaked outside the bedroom, exactly how the morning light slipped through the kitchen curtains, and exactly how Richard liked his coffee before he retired. Now I found myself staring at a ceiling I had never seen before, listening to the steady hum of an old air conditioner while wondering how a lifetime could change in less than 48 hours. I made myself a cup of coffee using the small machine on the counter, then opened the folder that held copies of the closing documents from the sale of my home. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. The purchase agreement, the transfer confirmation, the wire receipt showing nearly every dollar had been sent exactly where Michael had requested. I remembered asking him twice whether he was absolutely certain this would solve their financial problems. Each time he had looked me in the eyes and quietly answered, "It will save us, Mom." I believed him because I had never imagined my son would have any reason to mislead me. Around mid-morning, I drove aimlessly through familiar streets, trying to gather my thoughts. Without realizing it, I found myself passing the neighborhood where Richard and I had lived for most of our marriage. The moving truck was gone. The new owners had already placed flower pots on the front porch. Children were riding bicycles along the sidewalk, just as Michael once had. I smiled softly, wishing them happiness inside the home that had given my family so many beautiful memories. As I continued driving, another memory quietly surfaced. 3 weeks before I sold the house, Michael had seemed unusually anxious. He called almost every evening asking whether I had spoken with my real estate agent yet. He repeatedly mentioned deadlines, paperwork, and urgent financial pressures. At the time, I thought he was simply frightened about protecting his family. Looking back, I realized he had never shown me a single overdue notice, foreclosure letter, or bank statement. Everything I knew came from conversations. Nothing came from documents. That afternoon, I stopped at a small cafe I used to visit after church with Richard. While waiting for my lunch, I noticed a familiar young woman walking toward the counter. She looked at me for a moment before her face brightened with recognition. "Mrs. Brooks?" she asked. "I cannot believe it is really you." It took me a second to remember her. Emily Carter had been one of my second-grade students nearly 30 years earlier. We laughed about old-school memories before she mentioned she now worked as a loan specialist at a local bank. "How is retirement treating you?" she asked warmly. I smiled politely. "It has been eventful." She noticed the motel key lying beside my coffee cup, but was kind enough not to ask questions. Instead, we talked about families, old neighbors, and how quickly time seemed to pass. As she prepared to leave, she hesitated for just a moment. "I almost forgot," she said. "I think I saw your son a few weeks ago. He looked excited. He said he and his wife were finally buying the house they had always wanted." She smiled as though sharing wonderful news. I smiled back automatically, but inside, something became perfectly still. Buying the house they had always wanted. Those words echoed quietly through my thoughts long after Emily walked away. I folded my hands around the warm coffee mug and stared through the cafe window. For the first time since I handed over the proceeds from selling my home, I found myself asking not whether something had gone wrong, but whether I had ever been told the truth in the first place. I remained in the cafe long after my coffee had grown cold. Emily had already returned to work, completely unaware that a single innocent conversation had quietly unsettled everything I believed. I did not blame her. She had simply shared what she thought was happy news. Yet the more I replayed her words, the less they fit the story Michael had given me. If they had truly been on the edge of losing their home, why were they buying another one? Why had everything happened so quickly? Why had I never seen a single letter from a bank or a single document showing the emergency they described? I drove back to the motel with those questions circling through my mind. That evening, I spread every piece of paperwork across the small table beneath the window. The closing statement from the sale of my house. The wire transfer confirmation. My handwritten notes from conversations with Michael. I read each page carefully, hoping I had overlooked something that would make everything reasonable again. Instead, I noticed a different pattern. Michael had always spoken in general terms. There had been deadlines, but never dates. Financial problems, but never numbers. Urgency, but never evidence. I realized that every important decision had been made because I trusted his words, not because I understood the facts. The following morning, I called the real estate attorney who had handled the sale of my home. I thanked him for his work and asked a few simple questions about the transaction. He confirmed that everything had been completed exactly as instructed. The funds had been transferred to the account Michael provided, and the sale had closed without any unusual issues. Before ending the call, he gently reminded me that if I ever needed copies of additional records, his office would be happy to help. His kindness stayed with me after we hung up. It also reminded me that there were still people willing to answer honest questions without making me feel like a burden. Later that afternoon, I took a slow walk through a nearby park. Families pushed strollers along the walking path. Children chased squirrels beneath towering oak trees, and older couples sat together on benches, sharing quiet conversations. Watching them, I remembered something Richard used to say whenever life became complicated. When you cannot see clearly, do not rush. The truth does not disappear just because you take time to find it. Those words settled my heart. I no longer felt desperate for immediate answers. I wanted accurate ones. As I returned to the motel, my phone buzzed with a text message from Michael. It was brief. "Mom, I am sorry things have been difficult. Give us a little more time." I stared at the screen for several moments before placing the phone back into my purse. Not once did he ask where I was staying. Not once did he ask whether I had everything I needed. The silence inside those missing questions spoke louder than the message itself. That evening, I opened Richard's old leather notebook, the one I had packed at the last minute before leaving our home forever. Tucked inside one of the pages was a faded handwritten note he had left years earlier after we finished paying off our mortgage. It read, "A home is never the greatest investment we make. Character always is." I traced those words with my fingertips and quietly closed the notebook. For the first time since I stood outside that locked front door, I stopped asking how I had ended up alone. Instead, I began asking a different question altogether. If the truth had been hidden from me once, how much of the story had I not been allowed to see? The following Monday, I checked out of the motel and drove to the office of an attorney Richard and I had trusted years earlier when we updated our estate plans. The receptionist welcomed me kindly and asked whether I still wanted coffee with 1 packet of sugar, a small detail that somehow made the morning feel less lonely. When Mr. Henderson stepped into the waiting room, he shook my hand warmly and told me he had been sorry to hear about Richard's passing several years before. Once we settled into his office, I placed my folder of documents neatly across his desk. I explained the sale of my house, the wire transfer, the promise that I would live with Michael and his family, and the locked door that greeted me instead. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making careful notes. When I finished, he remained quiet for a moment before speaking. "Evelyn, I know this is difficult to hear, but based on what you have shown me today, the transfer appears to have been made voluntarily." I nodded slowly. I had expected that answer. "Does that mean there is nothing I can do?" I asked. He leaned forward gently. "It means revenge is not the right goal. Clarity is." Those words stayed with me. We spent the next hour reviewing every document line by line. He encouraged me to request complete copies of bank records, communication history, and transaction confirmations, not because he expected dramatic discoveries, but because understanding the truth mattered before making any future decisions. Before I left, he offered one more piece of advice. Protect what you still have, not what has already been lost. Driving away from his office, I realized I had been spending every waking hour thinking about the house I no longer owned. Richard would have reminded me that my future deserved just as much attention as my past. That afternoon, I found a small furnished cottage available for monthly rent on the edge of town. It was nothing like the home Richard and I had built together. The living room was modest, the kitchen was simple, and the porch overlooked a quiet pond instead of a backyard filled with maple trees. Yet when I stepped inside, sunlight streamed through the windows, birds sang outside, and for the first time in several days, I felt my shoulders relax. I signed the lease that afternoon. As I unpacked my suitcase, I placed Richard's photograph on the mantel above the fireplace and arranged our wedding album beside it. The cottage did not erase my grief, but it gave me something I had almost forgotten I still possessed. A place where my decisions belonged entirely to me. Later that evening, my telephone rang again. Michael's name appeared on the screen. This time I answered without rushing. He sounded tired, almost distracted. He apologized for not visiting sooner and repeated that everything had become more complicated than expected. I listened quietly until he finished. Then I asked one simple question. Michael, did you really need me to sell my house to save yours? The silence that followed lasted longer than any conversation we had ever shared. I heard him take a slow breath before quietly saying, Mom, I think we need to talk in person. After we ended the call, I looked around the little cottage. It was still mostly empty except for a few boxes and familiar photographs, but it already felt more honest than the promises I had been living on only a week earlier. Whatever Michael was finally ready to tell me, I knew one thing with complete certainty. This time I would listen with both my heart and my eyes open. Michael arrived at my cottage 3 days later, just as the afternoon sun settled across the little pond behind the house. Through the front window, I watched him step slowly from his truck, hesitating before walking toward the porch. He looked older than he had only a week earlier. The confidence that usually filled his stride had been replaced by uncertainty. I opened the door before he reached it. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked, May I come in? I stepped aside and welcomed him without another word. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table where 2 cups of coffee waited between us. The cottage was still sparsely furnished, but it already felt peaceful. There was no expensive furniture, no grand fireplace, no family photographs covering every wall. Only Richard's framed picture resting on the mantel and the quiet sound of birds outside the open window. Michael wrapped both hands around his coffee mug before finally looking at me. I owe you the truth, he said. I remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. We were not about to lose our house. The words landed gently, almost exactly as I had expected after everything I had discovered. Even so, hearing them spoken aloud carried a different weight. He lowered his eyes. We wanted to buy a larger home in a better neighborhood. Amber found one she loved. We did not have enough money for the down payment. He paused, struggling to continue. She believed that if we explained it as an emergency, you would never hesitate. I looked at Richard's photograph for a moment before asking the only question that truly mattered. Did you believe that too? Michael closed his eyes briefly. At first I told myself we would pay you back quickly. Then everything moved so fast. The house sold. The money arrived. Every day it became harder to admit what we had done. When Amber suggested changing the locks, we argued. She said everyone needed time before you moved in. I should have stopped it. I did not. His voice grew quieter with every sentence. I kept telling myself I would fix everything tomorrow. Then tomorrow became another tomorrow. I nodded slowly. Silence has a way of becoming its own decision. He looked at me with tears gathering in his eyes, but never falling. I know. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The room remained peaceful despite the painful conversation. Finally, Michael reached into his jacket and placed his phone on the table. There is something else you should know. He opened several text messages and handed the phone to me. I read conversations between him and Amber from the week after I had been locked out. I discovered messages I had never received because Amber had answered my calls from his phone while he was working, telling him she had already spoken to me. There were reminders she had sent urging him not to visit until things settled down. There were conversations about delaying difficult discussions because she believed I would eventually accept the situation. Michael quietly explained that he had only recently realized several of my messages had never reached him because they had been deleted from a shared tablet they both used at home. He looked at me with unmistakable regret. I should have noticed sooner. I should have come looking for you myself. I took a slow breath before sliding the phone back across the table. What hurts the most is not the money, I said softly. It is knowing how easily trust can disappear when honesty leaves the room. Michael lowered his head without defending himself. In that quiet moment, I finally saw not the little boy Richard and I had raised, nor the confident man who had asked me to sell my home, but someone who had spent too long confusing comfort with character and was only now beginning to understand the difference. Michael remained at the cottage for nearly another hour. Neither of us tried to erase the past with comforting words because we both understood that some mistakes cannot be softened simply by admitting they happened. As the afternoon light faded across the pond outside my window, he slowly reached into his jacket and placed a thick envelope on the kitchen table. There is a cashier's check inside, he said quietly. It is only the beginning. I took out a personal loan and borrowed against every asset I reasonably could because I wanted to start paying you back immediately. It will take time to repay everything, but I could not keep asking for forgiveness while doing nothing to earn it. I looked at the envelope without touching it. Money alone could never restore what had been broken, but genuine responsibility had a value that could not be measured in dollars. Why now? I asked softly. Michael lowered his eyes before answering. Because every morning I walked through that house knowing it represented your sacrifice more than my success. I kept telling myself I was building a better future for my family, but every day I felt further away from the values you and Dad spent a lifetime teaching me. Eventually, I realized I was living in a house that reminded me of my failure instead of my achievement. There were no dramatic speeches, no desperate promises, only quiet honesty spoken without expecting immediate forgiveness. Before leaving, he walked over to Richard's photograph resting on the mantel. He stood there silently for several moments before whispering, "Dad would be disappointed in me." I joined him and looked at the familiar smile in the old photograph. "Yes," I answered gently. But he also believed that character is not defined by the mistake someone makes. It is defined by what they choose to do after they recognize that mistake. Michael nodded slowly. "Amber and I have separated for now," he admitted. "I am not blaming her for everything. I made my own decisions. I ignored my conscience because admitting the truth felt harder than continuing the lie. I have a great deal to repair before I deserve anyone's trust again." I wished him peace, and after he drove away, I remained on the porch watching the evening settle across the quiet pond. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. During the weeks that followed, life settled into a comforting rhythm. Every morning, I walked around the pond with a cup of coffee, greeting neighbors who gradually became close friends. I joined a watercolor class at the Community Arts Center, something Richard had encouraged me to try for years. Twice each week, I volunteered at the public library reading stories to young children, discovering that purpose often arrives quietly after disappointment finally leaves room for it. One Saturday afternoon, my telephone rang. It was Michael. His voice sounded calmer than it had in months. "Mom," he said, "Emma and Lucas have been asking if they can visit you. They miss their grandmother." My heart softened immediately. "They never needed permission to be loved," I replied with a smile. The following weekend, the children climbed out of Michael's truck carrying a flower pot filled with bright yellow daisies and a plate of homemade cookies they had baked together. Emma ran across the yard and wrapped her arms around me, while Lucas proudly carried a small wooden birdhouse he had built at school because he wanted to hang it beside the pond. Their laughter filled the little cottage with a warmth I had almost forgotten was possible. Before they left that afternoon, Michael quietly handed me another envelope. This one contained no money. Inside was a handwritten letter thanking me for every school lunch I packed, every baseball game I attended, every bedtime story I read, and every sacrifice I had quietly made throughout his life. The final sentence remained with me long after they drove away. "I spent too many years believing your love would always be there no matter how I treated it. I will spend the rest of my life proving that I finally understand what that love truly cost." I carefully folded the letter and placed it inside Richard's old leather notebook. The cashier's check would begin repairing practical losses, but those honest words had already begun restoring something far more precious. For the first time since I stood outside that locked front door with nowhere to go, I believed healing had finally entered our family, not through forgotten memories or empty promises, but through truth, accountability, and faithful actions repeated one ordinary day after another. Nearly 1 year has passed since the afternoon I stood outside a locked front door holding a single suitcase, Richard's photograph, and a key that no longer opened the life I believed was waiting for me. Looking back now, I no longer think of that day as the moment everything was taken from me. I think of it as the day I finally learned the difference between loving someone and losing myself for them. The little cottage beside the pond has become home in ways I never imagined possible. Every season has quietly left its own gift behind. In the spring, white daisies bloomed beside the porch, reminding me of the flowers Richard used to bring home after especially long weeks at work. During the summer, watercolor paintings slowly covered the walls of my living room, each one capturing peaceful afternoons I once believed I would never experience again. Autumn brought neighbors who became genuine friends, while winter evenings were spent beside the fireplace with a warm blanket, a good book, and memories that had slowly transformed from painful reminders into quiet companions. My life did not become perfect. It became peaceful, and that proved to be far more valuable. Michael continued visiting regularly. Sometimes he arrived carrying groceries, sometimes fresh coffee from my favorite cafe, and sometimes nothing at all except a willingness to spend time together. The payments continued exactly as he had promised, never offered as dramatic gestures, but as quiet evidence that responsibility is built through consistent actions rather than heartfelt apologies alone. Trust returned slowly, one ordinary afternoon at a time. One Saturday, Emma and Lucas arrived carrying fresh birdseed and the little wooden birdhouse Lucas had proudly built months earlier. Together, they chose a sturdy maple tree overlooking the pond. I watched from the porch as Michael carefully lifted Lucas high enough to secure the birdhouse, while Emma pointed excitedly toward a pair of bluebirds already exploring the nearby branches. It was such a simple moment, yet it reminded me that the strongest things in life are often rebuilt one careful piece at a time. After they left that afternoon, I opened Richard's old leather notebook once again. Inside rested 2 familiar envelopes and 1 old brass key. The first envelope held copies of the documents from selling the home Richard and I had spent more than 4 decades building together. The second contained Michael's handwritten letter, its pages already softened from the many times I had quietly reread it. Resting beside them was the old key that no longer opened any door. I held it gently in my hand before smiling to myself. There was a time when that key reminded me only of rejection. Now it reminded me of something far more meaningful. Not every locked door is a tragedy. Sometimes a closed door quietly protects you from continuing to live inside a life that no longer honors your worth. I slipped the key back into the notebook beside the 2 envelopes and gently closed the cover. Richard often said that character is revealed not by the hardest thing life asks you to endure, but by the person you choose to become afterward. As I looked through the window toward the maple tree where Emma and Lucas's little birdhouse now rested safely above the pond, I realized that both Michael and I had spent the past year rebuilding something neither of us fully understood until it was nearly lost. Home had never been the house I sold or the one whose locks were changed against me. Home was the place where respect returned, peace was protected, and love no longer required me to surrender pieces of myself just to prove it existed. That was the door I had been searching for all along, and unlike the one that closed behind me a year earlier, this one would never need a key to remain open. Thank you for listening and for being part of our community. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories.